Chapter 3. The Storm Before the Calm. The Cormorant should not have been at sea. Every soul aboard her knew it, and most of them blamed Rob Vane, which was fair, because it was true. They were 20 weeks out of the Kettles, the last port at their own coast's far end, running east along the land for home, with a hold full of trouble. Rob had driven her into the dying weeks of a storm that had ruled this water since before any man aboard was born, and the storm was not done with her yet. The boy, Cole, had the dawn watch at the pump, and he was singing. He was 16, the youngest aboard, a harbour boy on his first deep water, and he sang at the pump when he was frightened because his own voice steadied him better than the charm sewn into his cap, which he was ashamed of, and kept anyway. The cook had fed him double the whole voyage out, on the grounds that the boy was still growing and the rest of them were past helping, and when the barrels ran short, the second helping had gone on coming, quietly, off the cook's own plate, which the watch knew and let alone. He had signed for an 8th share. The night before they sailed, Rob had heard him on the quay telling a girl what an 8th share of a first keel came to, and getting the sum wrong, and making it bigger. The dragon's breath was dying, and a dying thing is the most dangerous kind. For weeks it had stood like a cathedral roof of black water, walls with no interest in sinking a ship, only in turning her back. Now the walls were coming down. The swells had fallen from mountains to 40 feet, and then toward 30, but they ran crossed, 2 seas out of step, so the hull dropped into holes that had no bottom and clawed up faces that had no top, and everything not lashed twice was already gone. The sea that took Cole came over the port quarter while the ship was still shaking off the one before it. Rob saw it the whole way in. It was green and solid as a toppling wall, and it buried the waist of the ship to a man's height, and when it had drained off the deck the pump was still turning on its own weight, and the boy was gone from it. His lifeline swung empty, parted at the splice he had been taught to make on the voyage's first morning. For one breath there was a head in the water astern, a dark point on a grey hill, there and then not. Every man on deck looked at it, then every man on deck looked at Rob. "Boat!" someone was screaming, halfway to the falls already. "Boat! For the love of—" "No boat." The words were out of Rob before he felt himself choose them, in the flat carrying voice he kept for weather, and they were the right words. No boat ever built would live 2 minutes in a crossed sea, and the men who manned it would follow the boy down. Coming about would lay her beam on in the troughs and drown the rest of them inside the hour. 40 men spent for one already past saving. Every captain on this ocean knew that arithmetic, and the arithmetic was sound, and he would make the same answer again tomorrow. None of it helped. He had smiled at the boy's wrong sum on the quay and said nothing, and sailed. For a moment no one moved. Then the next sea came in over the rail, and the watch went back to the work of keeping her afloat, because she gave them no time for anything else. Tomas put his palm flat against the knot of red thread he had nailed to the mainmast, where he let no man near it, and held it there a long time, his lips moving. The cook had spat to leeward before every watch of the voyage. The boy had carried his mother's charm. Their observances half contradicted one another, and worked just often enough that no sailor alive would put out without his own, and the boy had drowned with his in his cap. Rob let them all be at it. A captain who took a man's charms took his nerve with them, and nerve was the only cargo left between here and the land. Holst came aft along the lifeline, hand over hand, and did not trouble to lower his voice for the helmsman, which was a message in itself. "That's the first," the sailing master said. "Of 41. You'll want to be keeping count." "I keep it." "Bram said turn back 3 days ago. I said it 12 days before that, in the roads, with the anchor down and every man of them alive. Under the streaming hood, Holst's face had gone past anger. He had taken the owner's wage and sailed against his own counsel, and he would work the helm of this wager until it killed him, and he would never once say aloud that the choice had also been his. Write the boy in your book, Captain. First price paid against your week of market. It's written. Get her head up 2 points. The sets are coming longer. That was true, and Holst heard that it was true and went because seamanship was the one tongue the two of them still traded in good coin. A week of market. That was the whole venture, as Holst told it, and Rob stood at the weather rail with the spray going over him and let the words do their work, because a man who has just drowned a boy owes the sum an honest reading. He had not crossed the sea. Nobody crossed the sea. The storm stood over the middle of the world the whole year round, and nothing lived on that water but a declared fleet in an open year. What Rob had done was stay on his own shore the whole way. 2 winters ago he had worked the Cormorant west along the coast, port by port, ordinary trade in ordinary water until the ports gave out, and then the coast did. And the last of the ports was the Kettles, a sealer's hole at the rim of the standing storm, where the charts went white. Sealers made that run every year and thought nothing of it. The place was far and poor, and safe enough in season, and no man with a choice wintered there. Rob had gone because of his father's box. The box had named a factor at the Kettles, a house's man on the spot, the breed that sits in a far port buying and selling and waiting on a master's word, sometimes for a lifetime. This one had handed over a cargo 10 years in a cellar, asked nothing, and seemed glad to see the back of it. The road home was the wager. Rob had sailed it out of season, straight through the dying weeks of the storm, while every other keel on the coast lay at anchor, waiting for the priests to ring the year open. The calendar said the sea could not open this year, and the storm was supposed to agree with it. Rob had watched the storm instead of the calendar, and bet that it was lying down a year early. If he was right, he came home first, alone, with a week of market to himself. If he was wrong, he drowned. That was his whole crime. A few stolen weeks, bought against the chance of drowning, and until this morning the price had been seasickness and short sleep. The old man lay lashed in his nest of oilcloth and tarred wool by the mainmast, 90 years old and dry as a relic, and Rob went and crouched beside him because there was nowhere on the ship he wanted less to be than alone with himself. Bram could not always say what year it stood, or whose deck he lay on, but he had crossed the Typhon itself, shore to shore and back, a boy of 11 on the last keel home before the storm stood up again, and on his good hours he could still tell a lull from a trap, and that was the only reason a sane captain carried 90 years of dead weight onto this water. She used to sleep cleaner, Bram said, without opening his eyes. The rain ran in the seams of his face, as though the face had been made for draining it. Last time the walls dropped. They dropped and stayed down. This one's twitching. He turned his cheek against the streaming deck, comfortable as a man in a feather bed, with the worn, smooth calm of the very old. Like a dog dreaming. And when a dog dreams, you let it lie. You don't go walking on its back. His eyes opened pale, rinsed of their colour by 80 years of weather. I told you that in the roads. You did. And here we are, walking. He patted the deck twice, fondly, the old hand light as paper. Then he went back to the other thing, as he always did when the water ran high, a small run of words in no tongue Rob knew, in an order that never changed by a hair. A cradle song, he had said once, the one his own mother sang on her last crossing, long drowned and still on his lips. Rob had stopped hearing it years ago, as a man stops hearing a hull work. Today, with the boy an hour in the water and the sea alive under them, he could not stop. The cry came up from below at the change of watch, and it was the one a sailor fears worse than any wave: water in the hold. A captain's place with water in the hold was on deck with his ship. He had known that since before his voice broke. He was down the ladder before he felt himself choose, past the men going to the pumps, aft along the flooded walkway to the shelf above the waterline, and he came back up into the rain with the True Venture held against his chest in both arms, ahead of the men, ahead of the pumps, ahead of the ship, a box of small metal letters cast in reverse, and a stamped book that could pull down towers. Somewhere off behind his own eyes a colder man stood and watched him do it, and understood at last what he was. The storm took 5 more days to die, and it died as Bram had said it would, twitching, the walls coming down into long grey ridges that ran under the ship instead of at her. The seam they had patched held to a weep the pumps could live with, and the men worked them in a silence that had not been aboard before. No one sang at the pump now. The watches changed around the boy's absence as men step around an open hatch, and the first morning after, the cook had filled the boy's bowl out of plain habit before he caught himself, and stood holding it a while, and tipped it back into the pot. They were eating green rope by then, the sound barrels long gone. Rob stood his own tricks at the pump, which a captain need not do, and slept the dead hours in the lee of the helm, and snored hugely, as he had snored across half the world. The port watch swore you could set a watch-glass by it. Rob, who had never once heard himself, maintained it was the hull working. Every day the storm spent dying was a day off the head start he had bought with a boy, and he had begun, he knew, to think of it in just those terms as spending, and to keep the count anyway. The cry came down from the rigging at the turn of the afternoon watch on the 5th day, and it was the other cry, the one that empties a man of everything he had been carrying. The lookout was jabbing both arms at the bow. For a moment there was only cloud. Then the rain thinned, and beneath the dark bank of the storm lay a darker line that did not move. Land. On the line, small against the grey, catching the one pale break of light in all that ruined sky, stood 13 towers, the castles of Dorinthos, 1 for the Duke, 1 for the army, 3 for the navy, 3 for the university, and 5 for the guilds, squat and old and richer than any crown. "First keel," Holst said at his shoulder, and for the first time in 20 weeks the grievance had gone out of his voice, because the words left no room for it. A first keel mattered for her news before her hold. Proof, visible from the walls, that the sea had gone passable while the calendar still swore it was shut, and news like that named the price of everything before there was a market to argue back. Every man on deck stood looking at the towers, and every man on deck was rich, and they had all stopped believing in it months ago. And there it stood. Then the sea ahead of them began to rise. It rose past 30 feet, and kept rising, hauling itself up one last time out of the whole dying width of the storm, a wall taller than anything the breath had thrown in weeks, leaning over the little ship as if to see what had been worth waking for. "Up the face!" Holst was already spinning the wheel. "Take her up! Take her up!" The ironwood bow came round to the wall of water, slow, slow, and the cormorant, 40 souls and a stamped book in her belly, put her shoulder into the sea and began against all sense to climb.